Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. Today I'll be going over how I put together the red and gunmetal metallic jacquard jacket that I wore recently in Sanctus. Now for those of you who are extra observant, you may have noticed that this is actually the exact same pattern that I used to make the sequin sateen bodice from that same video. All I did here was change up the design of the sleeve and the peplum, but most of the main pieces of the body are exactly the same. And then I also did, of course, make the matching beaded and sequined partlet to pair with this when I wanted to raise the neckline. But I will cover all the tiny little tweaks I made to this design over on the blue patterning table of doom, as always. But yes, I'll be using the same pattern I originally created for the sequined sateen bodice earlier in the year. That was the project that took me the most time, probably, I think, out of everything for Sanctus. But it was the sequining that made that project take so long, not the actual design itself, because it doesn't take much to construct. So I decided to use this same pattern to make something else out of this absolutely gorgeous red and gunmetal metallic jacquard. I was really almost afraid to cut into it because it was so pretty and I knew I couldn't get any more of this fabric. Having found it in person at a store here in Denver called Highlands downtown, they only had 2.5 yards left. That's all I had. And I knew I couldn't get any more of it if I made any mistakes, which is another good reason to use a pattern that I had already made once and knew I liked. And the first thing I really wanted to change about this pattern was just to make the peplum a little bit shorter. So I traced a new version of the front peplum, as you can see up in the right-hand corner there. And I'm just tracing a copy of the back as well, or at least the top of the back, and then I will draft a shorter version of that as well. Of course, the drafting of the first version of this weird drapey peplum part of this skirt portion of the jacket was based on an Alexander McQueen design, or actually a Sarah Burton for Alexander McQueen design, a blazer design that she had done in a collection several years ago. That sparked the initial idea for making this sort of drapey extension onto the peplum of the back of a jacket. So I will just extend the length of that peplum and once again draw this rectangular offshoot coming out from it that will hang like a asymmetric drape along each side. You could actually just do this on one side if you wanted to, have it be truly asymmetric actually. I'm coming out about 13 inches from the side seam and making that rectangle about 9 inches tall here. This will get changed around just a little bit, but that was what I started with for this second version. Technically a bit shorter than the first one I made, and I do still need to add seam allowance up here at the top of this, so I'll go ahead and do that. Try and walk my seams as much as possible when drafting so I can make sure that I didn't forget anything, because I honestly just don't trust myself not to be scattered completely, because you never know what the heck my brain is up to. But I can go ahead and start to cut this out and refine the shape a little bit further along the center back. And you can see I am just taping scraps of paper and random bits of paper together for most of this once again. Taping down my floops in the back so things don't get caught on anything and ripped, which is always extremely irritating. Better to tape your floops than have to tape the pattern back together once it rips, because at that point you'll be angry. So just tape your floops to begin with, and then you don't have to get angry later. I am going to add a little bit more flare. This, of course, is based off of my A-line skirt pattern, so the amount of flare that's built into this pattern so far is just the amount of flare given by my darts when I close up my skirt pattern. You can see what I mean by that if you watch my A-line skirt video, so I can put a card up to that here as well. But I'm just going to add in an additional wedge of fullness here, probably, oh, I don't know, maybe 20 degrees, if that, of fullness that I'm adding in here. If I were to measure with a protractor, which I do actually have one over here now, so I should actually just measure it and tell you if you wanted to be precise and follow me exactly, but I'm obviously not being precise while I'm doing this, so I'm just eyeballing it as usual. So I'm just adding in a little bit of extra flare. Then I will continue the line from my side rectangle drapey thingy down and my center back down, and then find a angle between them that I thought would work. Really, again, I'm just making it up. This is not an official procedure in any way, shape, or form. I'm just playing around, and I am going to actually end up making this a little bit shorter here, because the whole idea of making a new peplum pattern here is to have this be a little bit shorter than the one I made for the sequin version. But this will drape and fall like this in the back. And again, I need to tape down my floops. So I have my new peplum pattern, and I can start making adjustments elsewhere. I do want to make a few adjustments to the pattern itself, but also I wanted to use a different sleeve with this. So instead of my little tiny cap sleeve from the first time, I'm going to grab a slightly puffed long sleeve. I use this variation on my sleeve pattern all the time, and I actually first made this exact paper pattern when I was making the Luke Skywalker inspired dress years and years ago. But that sleeve pattern has just migrated away from being packaged with the rest of that pattern, and I use it all the time. It's just my long sleeve with a tiny bit of puff at the top. You've seen me do it many a time at this point. But as for the small changes I wanted to make to the actual main body of the pattern itself, the bodice of it all, I'm going to remove the center back seam allowance and raise the back neckline a 1/2 inch here. Then I'm going to make sure that that neckline still matches up with the shoulder of the side back piece. Here, I just want to raise the neckline and bring it closer to my neck a little bit because it is just a little bit too open, and the original version does kind of show the very edge of my bra straps, so I just wanted to raise and close that neckline just a tiny bit so I don't have to worry about that depending on what undergarments I'm wearing with these things in the future. And I will tape on a little bit of extra paper to the front side piece as well and do the same, making that adjustment at the shoulder and narrowing that down into the bust just so that I can bring that neckline in a little bit closer to my neck. Still making sure that that matches up with the shoulder for the back as well. Again, walking all my seams to make sure I haven't forgotten anything or messed anything up by making these adjustments. So my shoulder seam now matches up still with a 1/2 inch added on towards my neck, and that back neckline is raised a 1/2 inch. And I can start cutting everything out of this absolutely delicious fabric. Now, being a jacquard weave, this fabric is in reverse on the back and both sides are pretty, so it did take me a while to decide exactly which side of this I wanted to use. But in the end, I went for the predominantly red version as opposed to the predominantly gunmetal. This is the center front here. I'm pinning onto some muslin because I will cut out the front, back, and side back all out of muslin as well because I want to interline them with muslin, especially so I can run these through the serger and make sure that my edges aren't fraying, because this was one of those fabrics that if you looked at it funny, it wanted to start fraying apart. So I wanted to go ahead and flatline this with the serger as opposed to hand stitching around the edges as you've seen me do in some other jacket examples or bodice examples here on the channel. I wanted that extra protection along the edges to hold everything in place as I was assembling this jacket. I did have a lighter weight red cotton voile sitting around the studio as well, so I actually used that lighter weight to interline the sleeve pieces and also the peplum pieces. But for the main body of it, I used this kind of heavier, medium to heavyweight muslin. This is actually just muslin from moodfabrics.com. No surprise there. And then I will be using a gray rayon lining to line this today as well. But here I am just running these pieces through the serger so I can get that flat lining done and all my pieces prepped for assembly. Alright, stack everything over here on the ironing board and start putting these things together. I'll start by attaching the side backs onto the center back piece. Again, for the original version of this pattern, for the sequin bodice, I had a center back seam, but this time I cut this on the fold, so I didn't have a center back seam to deal with. Primarily because I didn't have enough of this fabric to actually match the print in any way, so I wanted to keep that solid so I didn't have to match the print or mirror it in any way, because it's kind of an abstract jacquard. I'll just fold some of this out of the way so I can sew both of those back princess seams here. Then I'm going to grab my pattern so I can go ahead and mark my notches around the bust on both my center front pieces and my side front pieces. That way I can line those up when I'm pinning the center front princess seams as well. But I'll go ahead and match up those notches. I just put pins in those places. You could also mark that with chalk or anything you would like. So a lot of people cut notches, that's what you're supposed to do, but I don't like cutting into my fabric until I'm ready, and I wasn't ready yet. I will have to clip around the curves of this bust, of course, because it's quite curvy, and therefore the fabric will not iron flat without it. But I'll go ahead and pin over the bust on both of these fronts and take everything over to the machine. I like to batch process stuff, so I like to prep as much as I can, pin as much as I can into place, then sew as much as I can, come back, iron, and pin as much as I can. That's always how I try and structure my order of operations. But over here on the machine, I am just using my regular Gutermann all-purpose thread here, a size 12 Microtex needle, sharp needle here in the machine, here on the Singer 99K. For those of you who might be new around here, this is a vintage Singer 99K model from the 1950s. It still has its original motor and Bakelite foot pedal, and I love this machine. I will never go back to a modern machine. I never thought I would be one of the vintage machine devotees, but ooh, once you try it, you really don't want to go back to the modern plastic clunky machines that just break and crack apart and never, I mean, this one never gives me any problems. I've actually had a couple of requests talking about how I maintain this machine and like the maintenance I have to do on it, and if I do my own maintenance and stuff. And it's like, yes, I do my own maintenance, but I haven't had to do anything except for give this a little tiny bit of oil and clean it every once in a while. That's like all I ever do with this machine. The tension never does anything weird on me. Like, I've had no problems since I started using this machine. So I don't have to do a ton of maintenance on it. So it's not like I can, like, that video would be very short. I'd be like, here, I put oil in the bobbin case area. Like, that's pretty much all I've ever had to do with this machine. So I'm afraid I'm not very experienced with the maintenance on this machine because in my experience, it has not required much maintenance at all. But yes, I'm just clipping my curves for both the back and front princess seams and pressing those open like so. And then I can start matching up the other seams. Again, the construction of this is not very difficult. It's just the beadwork I tend to do on things that make things take time, and I will have a little bit of beading to do on this later, but this will have far simpler embellishment compared to the swirling sequins that I did on the other bodice. And I'll just sew my little elbow darts in these sleeves here as well. And as I said, these pieces and the peplum pieces were also interlined with a lightweight red cotton as opposed to the muslin, just to keep these pieces a little bit lighter. And I will sew the side seams of my peplum pieces. I'm going to construct the entire peplum and then sew it onto the jacket afterwards. So basically everything from the waist down I'm sewing together at this point. Starting with these two side seams for both the outer fabric and the lining as well. At this point I had cut out my lining. What an idea. I do tend to put it off because working with slippery rayon lining is annoying. But once I have each side of the peplum constructed in both the outside and the lining fabrics, I will pin these together. I actually leave this little interior corner here. I just stay away from it, and then once everything's turned right side out, I made sure it was all in place and pinned it separately and hand sewed it shut, because my mind can't work around these corners sometimes. So if I can't figure out the logistical geometry of sewing around a certain weird shape, I just leave it and do it by hand. I have no problem sewing the last little few inches by hand, if it means that everything will lie perfectly smooth like I desire, basically. But otherwise I'm just bag lining this and leaving the waist open. And this long straight edge is kind of the hem of the jacket, so this is finishing that as well. Just pinning this all into place and give this a quick stitch. You could understitch parts of this as well. It definitely could get in here, but I'm going to be top stitching this and then beading on top of that later, so I did not bother to understitch any of this, but you definitely could try and get in to most of it if you wanted to. But I will clip my corners and curves and turn this all right side out once I have everything sewn together and lined. Then I will go around all of this and iron everything into submission. Make sure everything's nice and smooth and flat, how I would like. Don't forget to clip your corners, otherwise they will never be very pointy at all. But I'm just zhuzhing all the edges here and giving them a quick press. You can see I have pins in that interior corner because I still have to hand sew that shut. I couldn't figure out the logistics of it. I don't know why. Who knows what I was dealing with on the day. Some days my brain works better than others, and this may have been a worse brain day, I don't remember. But after I ironed everything, I actually pinned the edges into place exactly where I wanted them, so everything would stay smooth, and ran all of this back through the machine to add top stitching. And I usually top stitch a 1/4 inch out from the finished edge, but this time I'm actually top stitching just 1/8 of an inch away from the finished edge, so I guess this would be edge stitching instead of top stitching. What exactly is the distinction there? I'm going to be sewing beads on top of all this stitching later anyhow, so I'm putting it in here now for structure, but then I will embellish on top of it later, so none of the stitching will actually be seen. And you can see just how metallic the clear threads running through this in the gray parts of the fabric are over here under the lights. It's a very almost mirror-like finish on the gray sections of this fabric. Super pretty stuff. I think it's probably an Italian fabric. I think that's what they said down at Allen's when I was purchasing this. Although, who knows when they got it, because there's a lot of dead stock floating around that store. So to try and date most of the fabrics there would be sort of impossible. And I will just give everything one last quick press. And I have one side of my peplum done. Of course, I did all those same steps for this other side as well, the left and the right here. This does not have a center back seam on the peplum. It's just going to be open along the center back. And I'll just line these up along the back when I match it to the bodice later. But I can continue prepping my sleeves, pressing my sleeve darts, and then sewing the underarm seam here. I'll also need to put my gathering stitching up into the sleeve caps as well, so I can gather those down to fit into the bodice later. And this is really how I use my patterns most of the time, especially if I'm not making something for the channel, is I will take a pattern that I like and I'll take a sleeve that I like from something else and mix and match them. That's the thing about everything being based off of the same sloper, everything is being based off the same basic blocks. I know everything still fits together, so the pieces in all of my patterns that I make are usually quite interchangeable. So I can take the torso of one jacket and put it with the sleeves of another because it's all coming from the same origin point. They will all still fit together, and so I can mix and match and kind of play paper dolls with my own patterns and mix things up as I see fit. And I'll prep my sleeve lining in that same way as well. I already sewed the darts in this, but I can sew the underarm seam as well. I hope all of you are well out there. I've been having a kind of a rough brain week the last week, thanks to that ever-present and lovely visitor PMDD, my ever-reoccurring companion. But luckily I did have a distraction because I decided that, not being able to afford either in money or time my vacation, that I would take a virtual vacation, which is to buy a new video game like I mentioned. So I've been playing Red Dead Redemption 2 the last couple of weeks, and man, that is a really good game. So I haven't played the online one. Some people were thinking I was playing the online version. Guys, I don't play games online. I am not good enough to compete against other real humans. I just need NPCs is like the best I can hope for. And I play video games for the story, so that's why I chose to play Red Dead Redemption 2, and man, I mean, I'm heartbroken, but it was very good. And I'm just going to sew the rest of my lining together while I'm over here, sewing my princess seams in the lining as well, trying to take out my pins as I go, but failing quite spectacularly at this point. But again, I need to put my gathering stitching up into the sleeve caps, like I said. So after I press these underarm seams open, I can go ahead and do that. The curve on these is subtle enough that I didn't have to clip it, so that was nice. I kind of gauged that by after I'm pressing it. If it's like fighting me, then I know I need to clip something. And if I can press it easily into the shape I need, then it probably doesn't need a clip. All the rules I was taught in sewing are actually just guidelines and can be bent depending on the exact fabric and pattern you are using, honestly. So yes, clip your curves, unless you have a very loosely woven fabric where you can just steam it into submission, then you don't have to. So it really does depend on the textile, what rules you must or may not follow. But with that gathering stitching in my sleeve cap, I can go ahead and set my first sleeve in here. So I'm just matching up the underarm seam of the sleeve with the side seam of the jacket itself, and then gathering that sleeve cap in down to fit along the top, just keeping that gathering concentrated around the shoulder seam at the top there. Although playing Red Dead Redemption 2, it is troublesome for a fashion history enthusiast because most of that game is incredibly well researched and accurate, and it's an absolutely gorgeous visually game. However, they stopped researching when it came to doing the women's fashion in that game. It's supposed to be set in 1899, so we should have some excellent, late Victorian, early Edwardian fashion happening, and yet a lot of the women seem to be, and it ranges from 1860s gowns with really large bell skirts to really large bustle back skirts from the 1880s. And some people would have older clothes, but no one would still be wearing a lobster tail bustle in 1899. So I was confused as to how they got all the research so right for some things and then just ignored women's fashion entirely. And every once in a while someone will be in a perfectly great 1890s outfit or turn of the century outfit, and I'm like, how come this gal is good to go? It'll be not even a rich character or something where it would make sense that they had the most up-to-date fashion. It'll be someone random who has actual 1890s clothes and who has clothes from 1860. So, I mean, there was a ghost that had a dress from the 1860s, and that made sense. But everyone else, why are they still wearing their clothes from the 1860s? So that's my only critique for this game, for Rockstar Games. If you're out there listening, you're not. Is that you need a better consultant when it comes to women's fashion. I guess you do research and everything else. Why not have that be accurate as well? I'm confused. Of course, the cardinal sin of having female characters with their hair down is also committed. Actually, I would say, weirdly enough, the more accurate thing is the women's undergarments in the game are not bad. You see corsets and you see shifts and bloomers and stuff like that. The underwear is fine. I mean, obviously, I don't think characters would be walking around in it as much as they are, but why are the outer clothes so poorly done? It almost makes me want to make more 1890s things because I felt they were missing. But yeah, I finished constructing my lining. I set my sleeves into the lining as well. I sewed the peplum along the waist of the jacket itself, and now I can line the jacket. So I have lined up the lining onto the jacket, right sides together, basically slipped it inside of itself so that I can sew all along the front edge and the neckline of each side here. I'm actually just reinforcing the corners a little bit here since I know I have to clip them, and this jacquard was a little bit on the fragile side. But I'll leave my needle down, bring the presser foot up, swing around these corners, and just sew all the way around the neckline here, attaching my lining to the fashion fabric. I'll stop rambling about things that only 2 of you know what I'm talking about, because I assume many people watching are not gamers. In fact, I'm not much of a gamer yet, but I'm being converted slowly but surely here. There's not enough good TV to watch, in my opinion. I'm too picky, so I need something else to do in the evening after work. So lately it has been Red Dead Redemption 2, which has been quite fun. And yes, I will clip my interior and exterior corners and my curves, so I can turn this all right side out and put my sleeves back into my sleeves, etc., etc., using a knitting needle to poke those corners out. Seeing as I did reinforce them, they should be good to go. And then again, you could try and do as much understitching as you wanted along these edges, but I'm going to top stitch most of it, or not the back of the neckline, but the very front of the neckline, and down the fronts I will top stitch and again be beading them, but I will give everything, of course, a nice press. I have to wait for this iron to heat up though. Now, once again, just like the sequin version of this bodice, I am going to throw a little bit of plastic boning in here at the center front and also along the side seams. I do this in a very similar way to how I add boning in Victorian costuming projects. I just find that it helps keep things nice and snatched along the side of the waistline there without having to wear a long line bra or anything like that underneath. So I can just have the structure here within the jacket itself. And I just stitched this boning directly down onto my side seams, and then here in the center fronts, it'll be caught in that top stitching. So I'm pinning it into place here, and then when I top stitch along the center fronts and along the front neckline, it will be caught in that stitching and held into place. And again, you have seen this already if you saw the other video, or if you've seen me make any of my Victorian costuming. And I know I haven't had any costuming here on the channel this year, and that is because I'm trying to save money for all the house buying and moving, etc. And costumes can be quite expensive, just because, especially if you're using silk, that's many yards of fabric. So I did not plan on doing a costume this year because I was trying to be like sensible and practical instead, which is just, you know, not exciting. Although I mean, is anything in Songtooth practical? No. Probably the leather jacket is the most wearable thing out of that whole video. So maybe we can say that that is practical. I will now put some clips into the curve of my waist seam here, and you can see the peplum was already lined before I attached it, but I need to hide all of this seam allowance and finish up my lining on the inside of the jacket here. So I'm just going to press all this seam allowance from attaching things at the waist up into the jacket itself, and then I'll fold the main body of the jacket lining in on itself that 1/2 inch and hand stitch it all down along the waist to give me a nice clean finish for my interior lining here. And there is actually a third version of this same jacket bodice pattern that can be seen in Songtooth. The black and gold little jacket with tiny little tulip sleeves is actually, again, this same pattern, just with, again, a slightly different peplum and a slightly different sleeve. Minor changes and a whole different textile, and you would never know, except for that I just told you and that it's actually quite easy to see. But once I have the lining slip stitch into place inside here for that clean finish, I can actually finish this up with hook and eyes down the center front. I was supposed to put a placket in here, and yet I still haven't done it, so I need to do that sometime. Stick a little modesty placket down the center front of this behind the hook and eyes, but this just has, I think, maybe 8 or 9 hook and eyes down the center front of it here. And those are attached through, like all the way through the boning that is along the center front here, because it's that plastic boning I can sew through it, which means these are quite secure, which is always nice. And then I did use some gunmetal gray metallic, like hematite colored seed beads and bugle beads all along the center front of this and all around the edges of the peplum, including along the inside edge as well. Because these edges flap open, I wanted to cover that top stitching on the inside with a little bit of sparkle as well, because it could be seen when this moves around. So I put beads on the inside of the jacket as well. Seems strange, but I wanted it to be nice even when the flaps flap open. But because I had a tiny bit of this very fancy fabric left, I wanted to use up all of my scraps and decided to make a little partlet that could be worn with this jacket. Now a partlet, when I say partlet, I mean one of these little sort of vesty things from Tudor times. There was also sheer versions that were worn kind of underneath the gown. It almost reminds me of a fichu or like a kerchief that was worn in the 18th century as well. Something that was worn to fill in the low necklines of gowns or cover up the low necklines of gowns. But basically this is just going to be a tiny little shrug or vest. It doesn't have sleeves of any kind, although you could make one of these with sleeves, and I have since done so. Now I've just traced the top third or so of my basic bodice block here, and I was trying to decide what I wanted to do with the darts, and in the end, for this version, I left them exactly where they were, including this tiny little waist, technically dart, that is underneath the bust. But of course, I'm only going to have this be about 2.5 inches past the bust in length, so that dart becomes quite small. I'm going to come a 1/2 inch in along the shoulder seam, and then 1.5 inches up, and curve that down into one of these little grown-on stand collars. Instead of having to sew a separate collar on, this is just added on directly to the neckline itself. You see me do these quite often. It's one of my favorite necklines at this point. I use it all the time. For the last couple of years, I've been using it quite often, I guess. And I just kicked the shoulder seam out about 1/4 of an inch at the shoulder tip there, and then took off a 1/2 inch from the underarm as well, just to give that a little bit more room. Since I'm going to be wearing this over the jacket and over the sleeves of the jacket, I knew I was going to want a little bit of space in the underarm, so I just lowered that 1/2 inch on both the front and back. Of course, I don't have to put a sleeve into it, so I don't have to worry about moving the arm side around a little bit if I want to. But I'll just tape down my floops, make sure my darts are ready to go here with the correct kind of excess as I trim off the hem of this, I suppose. And this will be my partlet front. I don't think there's a modern equivalent for like a partlet like the closest we've got is a shrug, and I have like bad flashbacks from like 2003 of what a shrug is, so I don't like the word shrug. And I will do the same sort of things for the back, just tracing the top half of my back pattern here, tracing the neckline from the front onto the back. I do need to kick out the center back just a tiny bit to accommodate that sort of neckline, which you'll see in a minute. But again, kicking out the shoulder, 1/4 inch, and lowering it a 1/2 inch. And then yes, I'll just bring this out probably a good 1/4 inch right here at the center back and draw in my little winged back collar here that I do, again, tend to use. You've seen me use it before. I call it a Dracula collar sometimes because to me it just looks slightly vampiric and you can't go wrong there. I am actually going to tip up the center back hem of this as well. I curve this like so. Although it does make it a little bit hard to reach for the back of your jacket yourself when you're wearing it, so it's a little bit harder to put it on and maneuver it, but it looks nice, so oh well. And again, I still have the dart here on the back to deal with, and instead of leaving it like I did on the front, I did actually move this into a princess seam, especially because I wanted to use both sides of this fabric for the partlet. The jacket is all with the red facing out, but the partlet has the side backs are with the inside of the fabric facing outwards. So you can see that gunmetal, predominantly gunmetal side, just for a little bit of added interest, because I cannot help myself. I will separate this along the princess seam, and then add seam allowance to either side after I cut the dart fullness away here. Goodbye, no longer need that now that we have a style line. I can tape some extra paper on here and draw on some seam allowance, because of course, anytime I add a style line, I need to add seam allowance in. I have had a lot of comments about seam allowance actually recently too. A lot of people tend to get a little bit confused with me for why I add seam allowance. It just goes down to how I was trained in fashion school. I had it drilled into me that my patterns had to include seam allowance. So I think they probably in fashion school, because they're dealing with a lot of people who have never sewn before at all. And so I think a lot of people forget seam allowance. So they try and like combat that by making sure it's a part of your pattern, as opposed to, I know a lot of people out there use patterns with no seam allowance and they just remember to cut things out with seam allowance. I can't function that way because that's just not how I was trained. And I would absolutely forget at this point because I'm so used to working with patterns that do have seam allowance. So all my patterns have seam allowance, which means that even when I have my sloper and my basic blocks, they already have seam allowance everywhere they need. And then if I cut that pattern apart, I do need to add it back on because it's just how I was trained. I'm not saying it's the right way. I'm just saying that's how I was trained, and that's how I train others, I suppose, for that reason. So blame Woodbury University in California, because they were the ones who first drilled it into me. I did have to cut out the fronts and 2 back pieces of both my jacquard and then also a lining for this. I used the same fabrics that I used for making the jacket. And I will sew my little darts, tie off the ends of those, and then I can sew the center back seam as well for both the jacquard and the lining, leaving the top maybe like 4 inches of the back collar open so that it splits open in the back. Again, gives me a little bit more room back there, depending on how I'm styling my hair. Not that I have a lot of hair to style yet, but I will be growing my hair out a little bit here. Mostly because I'm tired of people telling me I don't make vintage clothes anymore, when the only difference is actually I can't do my hair vintage anymore. You would be surprised how 1940s and 50s, everything I make is, as long as I had my hair curled, but my hair is not currently long enough, so we'll get there. I don't know what these are, but they sure as heck aren't modern, so I don't know what people are on about, honestly. I feel like we can tell from my banter today that comments have been getting to me a little bit more than usual. Whenever I'm run down, I tend to apparently value the opinions of strangers more than I would otherwise, which is, yes, a little bit silly, but an occupational hazard in my world. But I can sew the back princess seams of my lining here for this, and the same for the jacquard as well. Again, not too many steps to put one of these together, although I do make a fatal mistake, so we'll get into that in a minute. This is the first time I made one of these, and I forgot, being a tiny vest, that I needed to do like the burrito-y method for the shoulder seams, so I just started sewing everything, and then I realized, oh, if I bagline this, how am I going to finish the arm size? So I'll show you how I finished the arm size, but it was not ideal. And when I made another one of these for that gold and black marble jacket, goodness knows I didn't do it this same way. I actually remembered and sewed it like I would a vest, as opposed to how I would sew a bodice, which is what I'm doing here. Order of operation fail, basically. And when I started painting the back princess seams, this is where I decided that I would have the side panels with the gunmetal side facing out. Of course, again, this fabric is just reversed, so the back is as nice as the front. It's just the reversed colorway, I suppose. And jacquard weaves are actually very interesting because it was a very early technology that relied on punch cards almost in the same way that early computers did, so it's considered kind of the father of computing, weirdly enough. My 2 favorite things, sewing and computers. I am an internet native. Clip my curves for the back princess seams, and again press everything open. and then I make the mistake of sewing both the shoulder seams and the side seams. No, no, no. Just do the side seams, leave the shoulders open. Ugh. Oh well. If you want to know what I'm talking about, search vest on this channel, and I have 2 different vest videos where I show what I mean, or any of my sleeveless dresses. I've made a couple over the years, I think, where I utilize the other method of sewing the shoulder seams a bit differently, which allows you to finish both the outside edges of everything and the arm size, because of course the sleeve isn't going into this. Silly me. And yes, the house hunt is going very slowly right now, because mostly everything I like on the market right now is over my price range, and therefore I am sad. So I'll update you when I have better news, basically. Alright, so here I am, about to sew these curved shoulder seams, like a fool, and also my side seams. I did also top stitch the back princess seams. If you're looking closely, you can see that. Once again, it'll be covered with beadwork eventually. Press all that open, clip my curves so that I can press open those shoulder seams with that little bit of a raised neckline. I do love that neckline. I actually recently made one of these with longer sleeves and the same sort of neckline, but with actually fold back lapels attached to this kind of neckline, and I really like it, so I'm probably going to be using that in the future. I actually hate making like a traditional lapel collar. For some reason, I can never wrap my mind around it. I don't know what's wrong with me. I really need to practice so that I can get better at it, but before then, I decided to cheat and just use this slightly tipped up neckline and then fold back lapels in the front. But it came out quite nice, so you'll see what I mean eventually. I'm sure I'll do it here on the channel soon enough. But here I am baglining this, which means I will have to finish the arm size in a different way. That was what I was just realizing it. Here I am realizing that in real time. Or not real time, this is sped up, but in the past, we're watching me realize what I now know, which is that I should have sewn this differently. C'est la vie. And I will clip my corners and my curves, so I can turn this all right side out for my vampire collar. And I can go ahead and get this all to sit nicely, using my knitting needle again to poke out my corners into place. Then I will give all of this a nice crispy press once again, and again I will top stitch the edges of this with that same 1/8 of an inch edge stitching that I used on the jacket as well. And then I had to finish my arm size with bias. This is a black silk shantung cut on the bias. This is 2-inch wide bias tape. It's currently pressed into single fold, it looks like here. But yes, I'm going to finish this with bias tape. It's not actually ideal. It is a little bit tight on this as well, because the arm side is such a close curve. I needed probably a looser woven bias tape for this, but I was just using something I already had on hand for this. And, you know, silk is a nice thing to use, but not the best finish for this. I'd say that while this is a good save, perhaps, it's not something I would plan to do on purpose. And I need to clip these curves because, again, these are quite close, and this is not going to sit even remotely flat if I don't. And I'll turn this bias onto the inside, and I'll actually pin this into place, and I'll hand stitch it down to the lining, like slip stitch it down. You could fell it as well. And then I will actually edge stitch this opening as well with that same 1/8 of an inch top stitching, because again, it will be receiving beading and sequins in just a moment. And this is what that looks like after the hand stitching is done and the top stitching is done. Again, this is still a little bit tight around these edges here, which thank goodness I lowered the arm size, so it's not uncomfortable in any way. It's just a little bit tight because of the closely woven bias tape I used, I suppose. But yes, then I sat here for hours and hours on end, as usual, doing my very favorite thing, sewing beads and sequins on. And I find, like, especially with this, each individual sequin may not be that interesting all on its own, but once you combine different finishes and textures of sequins and beads, things start to get a lot more interesting. So I try and combine matte sequins, shiny sequins, the large chevron-shaped sequins that are along the very edge of this, where I have the points facing down along the hem of the partlet here. They almost have like a, if you've ever seen what a sliced meteorite looks like, almost a meteorite kind of fleck texture to them. Very cool sequins. Those ones were from a shop in India that I used to really like, but then they took about a year to get me an order recently. I mean, I say recently. I received the sequins, I think, in like March, and I had ordered them in like the May beforehand. So it took about a full year. And that was only after bugging them through Etsy quite a lot to make sure that I still got my order or a refund. So I can no longer recommend that shop, although that's where I got these cool little chevron-shaped sequins. That's where I got strange little corrugated silver sequins I'm using here as well, the rectangles. So you can find really unique, strange materials on Etsy, but I cannot guarantee you will get them without having to follow up and bother people about it. So mixing textures, finishes, colors, things like that is really what helps add depth to embellishment, I think. And really, again, I'm just making things up as I go along. I kind of lay out everything I think I might want to use on my desk and then play around until I like where things are going, honestly. Again, not really a whole rhyme or reason to it, just messing around really and hoping for the best. Of course, my favorite sequin shop is still Cartwright Sequins, and they get things to you within a couple of days. No problem. Very lickety-split, those guys. So I love Cartwright Sequins. I have no problem linking them below because their service has always been impeccable, but they do not have the really unique shapes and finishes always. Every standard sequin, they've got it, but the really weird ones, not so much. I'm a sequin connoisseur at this point. If anyone knows of really good resources for sequins, let me know. I'm always on the lookout for more. They're not that expensive of a thing to collect. We all know that collecting crafting materials and sewing materials is almost a separate hobby in itself compared to actually using them, so I do fall prey into that one. But here's what this partlet looks like once I was finished with all my beading and sequining. Of course, this did take many hours split over several days while I was working on other stuff. I would usually pick this up and do a couple of hours of beading each night until this was done. Maybe 20-ish hours to do all the beading on this, if not a little bit more, maybe 20 to 30 hours for all of this, just because hand sewing stuff on takes a long time. But I do think in the end, it was worth it. And here is my finished red and gunmetal metallic jacquard jacket. And while I am very pleased with how this jacket came out, I am always going to be a little bit bummed I didn't have enough fabric to make a matching pencil skirt. So if any of you magically ever see this exact same fabric for sale anywhere in the world, honestly, let me know. In any case, I hope you enjoyed seeing how this project came together today, and thank you as always for watching. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.